Jamieson, good morning, and thank you very much for your time. Well, I guess it is Child Protection Week, and we've been talking to various people here on Morning News today about the seriousness of this tragedy that is still affecting our country. But you've made some studies that are revealing that this violence is actually very, very, very bad.
Unfortunately, it affects virtually every family and every community across South Africa. You know, we've seen two very detailed studies. One was a national study that looked at one point in time that showed a third of children experience physical violence, another third experience sexual abuse. But then there are community studies such as the Birth to 20 study, which was a long-term study working with a group from Soweto over the course of more than 20 years that showed when you add up the different forms of violence that children experience, and if you look at them witnessing violence in the home and in their community, that 99% of children are affected. And I mean, that's a terrible tragedy and a heavy burden for South Africa to bear.
Yeah, I mean, ordinarily we sort of assume wrongly that sexual violence will be directed more at girls than boys, but your research is showing that boys are equally also exposed to acts of sexual abuse as girls are.
So there's a different pattern in terms of sexual abuse of boys and girls. So actually the national study showed that more boys were victims of sexual abuse than girls will. But that includes offences such as being exposed to pornography. And when you look at rape and penetrative sexual abuse, then girls are more likely than boys to be raped. But what was very surprising is that actually the proportion's about 2 to 1. And whereas girls are coming forward in some numbers, we get about 18 to 20,000 cases of sexual abuse and rape reported to the police every year. The vast, vast majority of those are girls, whereas boys tend not to report abuse. And we know that those cases that are reported are actually only the tip of the iceberg, so that we think that, you know, there are large numbers of boys out there, and we're talking tens of thousands here, who are experiencing sexual abuse in the form of rape that are not coming forward and that are not visible to services.
Ms. Jamieson, from your study, what seems to be driving this ongoing scourge of sexual violence and abuse of our children?
So the drivers of violence are complex. As we see, I said violence is endemic in the everyday lives of children. And one of the factors that drives all forms of abuse is abuse in childhood. So it's actually a cycle whereby, when children experience violence in their own childhoods, they then they actually learn violence, so that you find that girls in later life actually are more likely to be re-victimized. They tolerate violence, they accept it from partners, and boys who experience violence grow up more likely to become perpetrators. And whereas previously we thought that that was something that really started in adulthood, we're now actually seeing that children learn very quickly, so that they are becoming violent, not in later life, but within childhood. So you've seen, the terrible tragedy at the Forest High School where, a child stabbed 3 other children. This cycle is much quicker than we previously feared.
Now, finally, very briefly, Ms. Jamieson, we tend to look to government, say government is not doing anything, they must do something to help. Government tells us it's got the right policies in place, it's got the right laws in place, but from what your picture that you're painting there, what your research seems to be saying is that the problem starts with us in our homes.
So the problem does start with us in our homes, and we need to, all of us, adopt a zero-tolerance approach to violence. And that includes not smacking children. Violence against children starts with discipline. It starts with parents who use violence against small children in the name of discipline, and that's how we teach children violence. It's on a spectrum, so often we see that, children who experience more serious forms of abuse, it started with that simple smack. So in our own homes, we need to take a zero tolerance approach to violence. We need children to understand that violence, all forms of violence, is not acceptable. But as to government, they're preaching at the moment that we all need to work together to tackle violence in our societies. But where is that message coming from? It's coming from the Ministry of Social Development. It needs to come from the entire cabinet. We know that children experience violence in their homes, but they experience violence in their communities, on the way to school. When they get there, schools aren't safe. They need to be violence-free in all aspects of their lives, and that includes, as your previous story showed, in their churches, in the community groups. So it does require each and every single one of us to review our own practices and say no in all circumstances to violence against children.
Thank you very much. That's Lucy Jameson. She's a senior researcher at the University of Cape Town's Children's Institute.